Oh, hello. Many Magic the Gathering players ask the question, how do I pick a modern deck? If we're interested in getting into modern, how do I go about picking that first modern deck? Well, I have with me here the one and only Alex Kessler of the Masters of Modern
Hey,
to tell
everybody.
us, how do I pick a modern deck, Alex?
There's
It's too expensive.
It's
Too expensive. Whatever your answer is, it's too expensive. Many all Magic the Gathering players say it's too expensive. How do I pick a modern deck when it's too expensive?
So there's a few ways to go about it, right?
Yes.
And generally, when people ask this question, there's kind of three different things to consider. One is your budget, right?
Mhm.
Two is what do you want? What cards do you own already, right? Are you coming from standard? Are you a standard player that's rotating in the format? Are you a commander player that has a bunch of commander staples that some of are very much modern legal? Or three, is there a strategy you want to go for, right? Do you hate burn? If you don't want to play burn, then that's a deck that you probably shouldn't play.
That's also problematic because burn is in just about every format, save perhaps commander, the best way to, on a budget, get into that format.
Interesting enough, in modern, historically it wasn't, because for a while it was that Naya burn deck, so you needed all the fetch lands and shock lands. Now there's that mono red aggro deck that's like just easy to jump into. Yeah, pretty fun.
Well, let's talk about this.
Okay.
Let's talk about this. Let's say that I am someone who is either interested in getting into modern for the first time, or maybe I was someone who played modern back in the day. Perhaps pre-Splinter Twin ban, or shortly thereafter, and I've taken my hiatus. I've come back. I like the way modern looks now, and I don't currently have a modern deck. I want to know how to pick that modern deck. What's the first way to look at this?
Well, I think the place to start, especially because you ended with like people that did play modern maybe at one point, is what do you have, right? The cool thing, even if you look at modern's history, is most of the shells that have existed in the past have some analogous deck now. Say you were a Birthing Pod player and Birthing Pod got banned and you were out. There's now the Heliod combo decks that are taking advantage of a lot of the same kind of Malira counter-based shells or Devoted Druid-based shells. And really, the individual combo pieces may have changed, but those are generally the cheapest parts of those decks, right? Like getting, especially now that they've been reprinted, Devoted Druids aren't that expensive. Getting Vizier of Remedies is really easy. Getting even Heliod, which is a modern mythic, is expensive, but it's not on the range of what can be expensive. It's not $100 Snapcaster Mage, right? So, or even Splinter Twin, the shell of a blue-red control deck that is either tempo-faced or not is pretty much going to be playable in modern in some fashion forever, be it either in Blue Moon decks or, last year up until Faithless Looting being banned, you had Arclight Phoenix decks. So there's always like a blue-red deck to kind of look at and maybe try and fashion. Right now, I'd probably recommend Grixis Death Shadow as the like tempo-based value engine blue-red focused deck. But there's a whole library of different things you can do. So it really, look at the cards you have and look at the playstyle you like. And if you are an old modern player, then there's definitely your old shell, unless you sold out, should be able to translate to something of modern playability. Pun intended.
Well, and that's also because that your old modern cards are likely to have retained value, and that's not always going to be the case, especially if something gets banned out. I mean, I feel really bad for anyone that bought a play set of Hogax right before the ban, but for the most part, those cards retain value. That's actually something where, for people who maybe are only used to playing standard, aren't as used to that idea that, well, prices will fluctuate, and sometimes, wow, a $30 card might drop on down to a $10 card depending on shifts. That's still some revenue to do, some trade fodder that you can work into another viable deck.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at, like, yes, the cost of modern today, if I wanted to buy in from scratch, new Magic player, maybe I've never drafted before, or like every time I draft, I sold all my cards back to the store to go infinite and have to buy a whole modern deck from scratch. The upfront cost of that is high, but if you then compare that to a 2-year cycle of playing standard where the metagame changes month to month. The buy-in of every deck I buy, every new set comes out, significantly affects the metagame. And then at the very end of that period, 75% of my cards become worthless. And so like it's a little bit of a upfront cost versus a like a continuous burn of cash and funds, but
Right.
like in the long run, standard becomes a much more expensive thing to be a metagame focused player on versus modern, where I've kind of had the same Jun shell since 2014,
Right.
or maybe 15. When did Modern Masters come out so I could buy Tarmogoyfs? And the affinity players until very recently kind of have always been able to play their deck. Merfolk players famously have had to make minimal changes over the last 4 years.
Almost none. Almost no changes.
We almost had blue-green Merfolk and nothing happened.
Yeah, that was the one big shakeup. It was like maybe green will get us there. But actually, there are modern decks available for not a big buy-in.
Mhm.
So I do agree with you on the premise that if you're going to continually have to be buying for standard, that really does add up. So if you think you're playing Magic the Gathering for more than, say, just a year, and you're playing standard and you're going to keep up with standard, that ends up being far more expensive than modern. But even if you're saying from absolute scratch, I'm going to buy into modern, there are budget modern decks available for, quite frankly, less than some of the biggest standard decks right now.
Absolutely.
We'll talk budget in a second, but let's take that standard player. Let's say I have been playing Magic, and let's say I maybe do have some standard decks. Are there any standard decks that can translate over into modern either now or maybe over the last couple of years? Because maybe there's somebody watching now who played standard 2 years ago, 1 year ago, something like that, and standard rotated, and like many of us do, fell out of standard, and now that deck's sitting on their shelf. Is there any way to come over into modern through standard?
Yeah, so I mean, even if you look right now, we mentioned MacLeod, right? MacLeod is a standard-based staple. There's a Pioneer deck that even extends into modern.
Right.
The Fires deck last week at at Magic Fest Reno, there was a PTQ, modern PTQ, and one of the top 8 decks was a deck based on Fires of it. Fires of Invention?
Yes.
Fires of Invention. So, there, and a lot of the planeswalkers you can take advantage of in that are from recent standard sets. I mean, one of the most played cards in modern for blue-white control decks right now is 3-mana Teferi.
Right.
And even like if you were to take the top 5 planeswalkers of all time in modern, 4 of them were printed within 2019.
Yeah. So if
So
you're a sicko who wants more Teferi, modern might just be for you.
we also get to play with Stoneforge Mystic next to it.
Right.
Finally.
It's actually pretty cool.
So even the Bant snow-based Cobblade deck was playing Ice-Fang Codals and Spell Quellers instead of Squadron Hawks, but it was still doing that like classic Cobblade, strapping on a sort of Feast and Famine that you find with Stoneforge Mystic, and like keeping counter magic up as you apply pressure. So like
It's so cool that there's a snow-based deck right
well,
now. I mean,
yeah.
that's just so cool.
maybe problematic, but we'll find out. I know in Pauper it was problematic.
Yes,
or
we banned it out of Pauper.
Yeah. So we'll see if that survives in modern. But the just the diversity of what you could do, and the fact that so many standard cards are powerful. I think that's kind of a misconception that people often have about older formats or standard in general, is that there aren't new cards that are printed that are good enough to see play in modern. And that's just been untrue. I mean, we did a whole episode where we went through every set in the last 8 years, and we're just like, how many cards were playable out of this format eternally? I think Rivals of Ixalan lost. I think that was the one set that like had
That's
like one card.
Surprise, right?
But even like Dragon's Maze, which is famously the worst set in a long time, had Wear and Tear, it had Eidolon of Great Revel, it has
Voice of Resurgence was there for
is-
a while. Is that still Voice of Resurgence still doing anything?
It's definitely fallen down, partially just because the world of instant speed playing has fallen kind of back a little bit.
Right.
It was very powerful in a world where Splinter Twin was around. Like there's a few cards that have gotten worse because they were good answers against Splinter Twin.
Right.
Voice of Resurgence, and Ben Bateman, my co-host, his favorite card, or one of his favorite cards of all time, Spellskite, has also just like, because Infect has lost some of its speed, and because Splinter Twin has fallen by the wayside, it like no longer was like this like, oh, people can't beat this card.
Right.
But Infect's back. I mean, that was one of the decks that top 8'd green, white, Infect. They got the new core that the ant instead of mom, the taps to protect him from colors, which was cool. And then I think, but back to kind of the conversation at hand, which is standard decks and translating that into modern. It really, it depends what deck you were playing, but even Arclight Phoenix was the best deck in modern 6 months ago. And Hogak being banned, even if you invested into that Hogak deck, yes, Hogak went away, but Dredge is still one of the top decks in the format, even without Faithless Looting.
Sure.
So there's most of the time these modern decks are versatile enough that they can dodge around banning. Sometimes there's a card that gets banned out of it that kills it. KCI, which is Clank Clan Ironworks, which I'm glad is gone purely from the fact that I don't have to say that all at once ever again, was a card. But that was banned partially due to the way it works with the rules is weird and isn't working the way we want it to. And its win percentage on top of that is problematic, less than this is too strong for decks to beat, I guess. And so, but there is ways to translate your standard collection into modern. It's kind of was built to do that. I mean, in some ways they were saying Pioneer was introduced for a similar fashion, where you're supposed to be able to take standard. Look, modern exists so that people have buying confidence in standard, right? Like that's why they invented modern. Legacy was impossible to reprint cards for, so the barrier to entry due to the reserve list was never going to go away. And Wizards realized that they needed a non-rotating format, that so when people invest in standard cards, they know that some of them are always going to be worth something. There's a place for my Heliod's or my I'm trying to remember expensive standard staples right now, but there's a place for the cards that you play with in standard that you invested in, so when rotation happens you're not totally wrecked. It's not like, oh, all of these cards just go in the bin. And that's what modern was created for. Pioneer is meant to kind of supplement that, where that also lets some of those standard cards have a life beyond standard. But modern has always been able to be one of the main features of how it functions and how that card economy works.
And I think that I don't want to get into a whole thing about Pioneer. I've done lots of Pioneer content on my channel. I do think that ultimately, and I'm going to be talking more about this, that modern is going to beat out Pioneer in the long run. But never minding that, even so there is ways and there are decks that where standard translates into modern. And of course, I always just say that you get aggressive with your trades, start up trading standard staples for modern staples, and then working your way from having played standard. Even if your standard deck doesn't directly have a version in modern, you can start just simply trading to other standard players for some modern staples that they might have, or for cards that other people who play modern might want, and then just trying to get as much value out of that standard deck towards a modern deck as possible, so that, let's say you are shooting for average modern deck these days about $500, $600, $700, I'd say. Drop off Jund at the end of the list and drop off Mono Red Blitz at the beginning of the list. And you're talking about maybe the $500 to $700 range. But if you've got $300 worth of standard cards that you can convert into modern, then you're only talking about a couple $100 more investment on your part, which for a deck that never rotates and only has to worry about a potential ban really isn't that bad. What if I am on a budget and I want to just buy it from scratch, though? So what are some modern decks you might recommend people look at if they are on a budget? And so let's say I say to you, I don't have standard right now. I literally, I've come back. I know how to play Magic. I want to play modern. I just do not have any card assets. I'm buying in from scratch. I want to do it on a budget. Mono red, we know mono red. Besides mono red, what am I looking at?
So I think at that point there's resources out there, right? MTG Goldfish is out there, and they have in the modern metagame section of their page a decks under $200. And Saffron Olive and Corbin Hausler on different platforms both regularly will do streams where they're like looking at, here's deck lists that we think can perform at a budget. And some of that is looking at, kind of what you want to play, right? One of the things that's great about modern is the format is diverse enough that if there's a playstyle you want to play, you might not be able to top 8 a GP with it, but you'll be able to have a great time at F&M playing it, and you'll be able to be somewhat competitive with that deck. And so really, it's hard to say what you, the person, would want to do. For instance, I know that I would just recommend play Merfolk to you. I've like Merfolk has top 8'd and won more GPs than any current legal deck in modern. The one it's tied with is Affinity, who recently had a card banned out from it. So right now you're on the top. So as far as specific decks that I would recommend are concerned, one that I would recommend is the Soul Hoarder Blinky Decks.
All right. I'm not too familiar with that one. What is that?
So basically, the idea is you're taking advantage of just all the different ETBs you have available in the game, being it blinking back blade splicers to just kind of controlling the board with flicker wisps, and you have this engine out of Soul Herder, which lets you kind of blink things every turn in a way that does gain you advantage, and then provides also a threat that gets bigger and bigger as the game goes on. That's kind of like when you go through the value thing, that's always hovering near the top that I always lean towards. Other value decks that like you can probably pull off without having the expensive cards in it.
Storm.
I mean, Storm is there.
Storm is actually putting up really good results, and first of all, the fully upgraded Storm deck is really affordable. The price is showing on the screen now. I don't have it offhand, but it's in the couple $100 range, and you can put budget builds of Storm together. Like, just to start, just going into your local game store to play at the weekly Modern event, you can put some budget Storm lists together for $100.
Right. And that's like the problem with Storm, and this is more for the and it depends where your prospective player is coming into it, right? Where are they a top end, someone who's played a lot of Magic, but for some reason at this moment is out? Then Storm's great, because that also means they're probably returning, and returning players love Storm because generally they were around in an era where Storm was great.
Yeah.
And Storm is always a deck that you're going to have a chance of winning with. And that's the other thing with Modern that can be great is, it's always funny when you I've played in Grand Prix where I've metagamed.
Right.
I've built a deck that's like, here's the top 8s for the last 3 GPs. My deck has a great matchup against all of them. And then game 1 is against Goblin Bushwhacker decks that I had didn't test against and just get my deck handed to me. And then the next game is against a deck that's playing Collected Company and 8 copies of Blood Artist.
Right.
Where you cast this card and now I can't win because you can sack your board and do 10 damage to me. Versus I was ready for Jund, I'm ready for Splinter Twin or Birthing Pod or whatever. And you end up in a format where really it can be very diverse and you can do well with random decks that are out there.
So rogue decks are a thing in Modern.
Yes.
So people who feel like maybe even they like to brew their own decks, or they like to play decks that are off the radar decks, they don't need to feel that Modern is a format where you're either in one of 3 decks, one of 4 decks, or you're just out.
Well, no, I mean, some of the coolest stories about Modern are what Zach Elsick did with Lantern Control.
Sure.
Right? That deck was not a deck. All the cards were available. There was no new card that was printed into the format. Most of the cards were affordable. Zach, with the help of different Reddit communities or MTG Salvation forums, I believe, back in the day, were working together to build this deck. He top 16s a GP one weekend. We went through the list. It was this off the walls, insane deck. Lantern, for those who don't know, is a deck that using terrible draft commons that mill your opponent one at a time artifacts, and the card Lantern of Insight, which lets you see the top card of your opponent's library, prevents them from ever getting a card they want again. Because you can be like, oh, you're getting a land next turn, that's fine. Or oh, you're getting the hate card you need to beat me, I'm going to mill that card.
Right.
But looking at it on paper, it looks like a pile of draft kind of throwaways. And so we brought Zach Elsick on. He comes and was like, this deck has no bad matchup. This is the best deck in the format.
Right.
And we're like, okay. He then literally that weekend wins a GP with the deck. And now
created an entire type of deck that then plagued Modern for quite some time.
Correct. Multiple times was threatening to get cards banned out of it, was one of the best decks in the format for a year, and no new card was printed. And this has happened time and again.
Right.
Death Shadow decks, wore a deck. It was about using Gitaxian Probe to pay your life down and using cards that gave Death Shadow double strike to be able to kill them early in kind of a weird aggressive version of the deck. Gitaxian Probe is banned. Then they start putting Thoughtseizes in there, and they start putting more control cards in there, and it ends up the deck is actually the best deck in the format. No new card was printed. This was just the deck that existed, but because no one was trying that version of it yet, no one really tried it. And then the third big time this has happened is Amulet Titan. Pile of cards that were not worth anything, uses bounce lands, and Primeval Titan, which at that point I think had just been a GP promo, so it was at its cheapest it's ever been. It was $12. Uses Amulet, which is a card that I loved back in Zendikar Standard when I was trying to use the rune, the ghost that lets you blink lands into play to like play Halimar Depths and and ponder off of it, but like had never seen real competitive play. Like people would play it, it was a joke deck, and then the Modern Pro Tour happened, and 2 players top 8'd with it.
Right.
And it went from being the worst deck to a deck that needed a card banned out of it 3 months later. And there are rogue decks out of Modern right now, I promise you, that are that level of good. People just have not been creative enough to put the pieces together.
As someone I've always approached Modern as an enthusiast. I don't want to say casual, but just as a format that really is kind of there for someone who, I don't grind GPs. I'm not looking to top 8. I'm looking to have a deck that I can keep and learn how to play and enjoy. And I've always felt from that perspective that a lot of people approach Modern as having kind of tunnel vision, where they do think that it's just these top 3 decks that nothing else is viable, when in fact a lot of the people piloting those decks, as you said, they're expecting Jund, they're expecting, well, up until recently, Affinity. They're expecting, these classic decks, and you can come out of nowhere with a rogue deck or with a tinkered deck. Maybe you took an established deck and you made alterations to its strategy. You can do clever things in Modern. It really does have room for brewing and engineering and home brewing and things of that nature. I mean, you were talking about Zach Elsick, and I know that one thing about him is he just does not want to play Magic Online, and he only plays with cards that he can own and have and go down to a game store and play. And that's why not only did he invent Lantern Control, but why Lantern Control was actually the budget build for a while. You could put Lantern Control together for $200, and that's because he was just like, he's not going to drop $2,000 on experimenting with a deck to win, and he was able to dive in there. And I really wish more people would approach the format that way, and can approach the format that way.
And I think that's kind of the beauty of Modern, right? The card pool is so large that there's all of these diamonds hidden in the rough out there. And you have the ability to kind of take your pet strategy and get good at it, right? Like that's the other thing, is that because it's non-rotating, you can spend 2 years trying to get the perfect Hardened Scales deck, or trying to get the perfect Training Grounds based deck, which like that deck doesn't exist yet, but it could. They keep printing cards that make Training Grounds better and better. And like one day that card could just be the best deck. I mean, a good example is going back to Hogak. Vengevine has been a pet card of mine since it was the first competitive standard deck I ever played. And I've always had like a Hedge and Crab based Vengevine deck in my pocket at all times, being like, one day this will be good. And then Hogak's printed, then and the right shell is printed, and oh great, these cards are all now very powerful. And I know how to play with Vengevine. Like I'm already, from a skill set perspective, kind of above and beyond my opponents, even because, I've been practicing with this one deck forever. There's a reason Jund decks top 8, when every pro player you asks, is Jund good, says no. And it's because Jund players have a foiled out Jund deck that they've had for 10 years. That they like, a new card, maybe they add it, but they like keep their deck together. They play the same deck every tournament and they get good at it. And like Jund is obviously the top end of expense in that level, but like there is a whole library of 8 racks and the mono red aggro decks and Merfolk and Soul Sisters, and these decks that, once in a while will have a chance. Soul Sisters is having a more of a comeback because of Heliod, because there's now a combo in the top end. And historically, it's the only mono white deck to win a GP. In fact, I think still famously, mono black is the only mono color that has not won a GP.
That's interesting.
Because like Elves has one, Merfolk has one, Soul Sisters has one, and then like a library of mono red decks have one. Actually, I think the mono red deck that had won first, though, another budget deck that's weird and left field, was Skred Red. It wasn't Burn, it wasn't Goblins, it was this weird, no one was paying attention to Snow Mountains at the time, and the fact that Skred hitting Boros Reckoner is a lot of damage, and Koth is one of the most powerful cards ever printed, or Planeswalkers ever printed. It just is so pigeonholed in, you have to play exclusively mountains, otherwise this card is bad. That people weren't taking advantage of it, and then they added the new Chandra at that time, the four
Torch of
Defiance that has 4 abilities that is basically the Jace the Mind Sculptor of red Planeswalkers, and top 8 won a GP. And like that's kind of the beauty of Modern, right? There's so many different things you can do. that you don't have to come at it being like, I need to have the best deck. I have to pay for it right now. I'm going to look at top 8s. And you don't even need to plan against those. You just have to get good at piloting your own deck.
Is there a difference between, say, investing into staples versus investing into archetypes? And what does that even mean? Or what do I need to know about that if I am buying into Modern to a certain degree?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the more played a card is, the more expensive it is.
Right.
So, for instance, fetch lands are the premier example of this, where
Right.
the more fetch lands you own, the more decks you can play. Another non-land based one would be Snapcaster Mage, right?
Right.
Like a playset of Snapcaster Mage could set you anywhere from $300 to $400, depending on what day of the week it is.
Yes.
But once you have 4 Snapcaster Mages, every blue deck under the sun is a little bit more available to you. Versus the best example historically is Affinity. Right now, Mox Opal was banned, so it's a little bit different. But that deck, none of the cards, or most of the cards in Affinity, weren't really translatable to other strategies. If I dropped the $100 to $150 on Ravagers, depending on what year it is, Affinity is the deck that those will belong in.
Right.
Maybe someone's going to come up with an off-the-wall artifact sacrificing strategy that can take advantage of that feature of Ravager. But that wasn't ever a metagame defender. And if that were to happen to be a tier 1 deck, Ravager's price goes up. So there is like kind of a question you need to ask yourself. In the long run, do I want to have, like, if you want to get into Modern right now, buy a niche deck, buy an 8-rack deck, or something that every
Really,
single card.
8-rack?
Well, I mean, you have to be a very specific person to want to play 8-rack.
Yes, I love 8-rack.
Yeah.
I'm just surprised that's your answer to, if you want to get into Modern, buy 8-rack.
Well, I think it's just inexpensive.
Sure.
And
Aside from the playset of Lilies.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. The Liliana. Yeah. So my best legacy performance is playing Pox, which is funny. But or I guess the classic example is, the mono red aggro decks. Is all of those cards belong in that deck. The ones that do translate to the other ones are generally more commons, like Lightning Bolt, that are in free, and not actually, but to most extents, they give them away now.
Yeah.
But those cards won't translate as well. Or do you want to make the decision to maybe invest in cards to build a collection to be able to play more in different decks? And now one thing I will say is, especially at your local game store, or in the way 90% of the populace is going to play Modern, you don't need fetch lands as much as people think you do.
Yes. One of the classic things I always look at, especially if it's a 2-color deck, literally, when you're on MTG Goldfish, say, and you're looking at prices, if you are looking at a 2-color deck, just take the land base off of that deck and see the cost, and then say to yourself, I could build with shocks only a 2-color, never mind all the fast lands and the fetch lands and all of that stuff. That is ultimate efficiency. But honestly, 6 mountains, 6 islands, and 4 shock lands, or what have you, and it's not the best. And there might be some games where that bites you in the rear, but you have just cut 80% of the price tag off of that deck, and you can work your way towards, I'm going to get a fetch land, a fast land, what have you, over the years, over the months. And meanwhile, you're still showing up, you're still playing, you work on up trading, you work on finding someone who, I've got the Kaladesh red-blue fast land, and I will trade it for a whole bunch of standard cards. That's a great trade. Get it, stick it in your deck. Now, I got one. I did that early days when I was into Merfolk. It sounds crazy, but one of the most expensive components of Merfolk early days were Mutavaults before they saw the reprint. It was Mutavaults and Aether Vials. And I literally built Merfolk on pennies by building it with 0 Aether Vials and 0 Mutavaults. And then, when the Mutavaults got reprinted in Standard of all places, I aggressively went after them. I got them for pennies as a result, because not everybody was doing mono black then. And so I got those Mutavaults, and my deck got powered up, but I had been playing with Merfolk leading up until then. I didn't have to wait. And then Aether Vials got reprinted in a couple of the Modern Masters. I was able to go after them there. And I did it bit by bit. And it doesn't have to be an all-at-once sort of strategy. You can go for 90% of a Modern deck and then leave the other 10% to be goals.
Right. And even if you look at like my preferred play style in pretty much any format I end up in is going to be a blue-white control deck. And you can get away with 4 Hollowed Fountains, 4 Glacial Fortresses, 4 Field of Ruins. Like currently they're playing 4 Field of Ruins, which is an uncommon that was just reprinted. And a bunch of basics. And then even like if you want to look like, if you can't afford Stoneforge Mystic, play Wall of Omens.
Right.
If you can't, or Thalia, right? Or, you know, there's all these alternative cards. Like if someone were to come out with me and they were playing 4 Mana Leak, not expensive, and their top end was the original Theros Elsbeth,
right?
The 6 mana one. That's an insane card. If you've ever gone to the point where you can cast that Elsbeth, you win.
Right.
And none of that is expensive. I just made a deck for you that is going to cost you less than $200, and it's not going to be a ridiculous. I couldn't laugh at you for playing that against.
Right.
You're missing, you know, some of the pieces, but you get Spell Queller, you get the new Teferi, you get even 5 mana Teferi, which has gone down in price. Where me and Ben literally spent 2 years like surprised on that this was a better card than Jace the Mind Sculptor. And currently I think it's less than $10. Mana base, yes, you can do fetches. You can do like 4 Hollowed Fountains, or not Hollowed Fountains, 4 Flooded Strands and 4 Celestial Colonnades, and like go in on that, but you don't need it. You can even play like Fairy Conclave if you really want a manland. If you want to do more of a Planeswalker tribal, there's the new colorless land that becomes free if you have 4 Planeswalkers in play to animate from War of the Spark. So there's like so many different options out there. That budget is one of the cool things it does, is it lets you find cool cards. It's how, you know, these different deck builders in Magic history have come up with cool strategies.
Right.
One thing to also bring up about the mana base conversation is it is one of the best things about the Snow mana base for Modern Horizons, right? Like with just 4 Arcane Astrolabe, I said that correctly, right?
Astrolabe.
Astrolabe. With 4 Arcane Astrolabe, you can make any color combination work with mostly basics.
Right.
So that's definitely left down kind of the need for the fetch based mana base, and allows people to now play 4 color decks with much less expensive mana bases behind them.
Yeah, I cannot encourage viewers enough to go look at modern decks and cut off the mana base and just honestly look at their cost, scroll down and just see, oh my goodness, there are all these dollar cards, and then all the money is in the mana base, or and say, okay, let's shoot for a budget mana base and then a full-on modern deck, and then work from there. It's just one of the best overall strategies.
I don't think there's a 2-color mana base that needs fetch lands.
Right.
In modern, unless the only one I can think of are ones that are taking advantage of the delve mechanic.
And you know what? If the worst thing that happens to you is you sit down to a game where you only have blue mana open and you need red for a lightning bolt, and you end up losing, and that's what saved you $500, then that's what saved you $500.
Yeah.
You know, at least you still got to play some Magic, and it doesn't come up every single time. How much do I have to be worried about things like bans hitting my deck? How much do I have to worry about bans that don't hit my deck, but that change the meta in such a way that my deck is no longer going to be as viable as it was? That's one thing that can definitely be off-putting, is the idea of, okay, I go ahead, I trade all my standard cards out, I put in a couple $100, or maybe I am going to invest in a larger deck. Whatever my way of getting there is I get my modern deck, and then a month later, is it going to get banned out? Even a year later, is it going to get banned out, or the meta going to shift? How reasonable is that fear?
I mean, I'm not going to lie to the audience. I mean, like I, as among with some other consistent modern players, has that 2 pages of my trade binder that has 4 Birthing Pods, 4 Splinter Twins,
right,
4 Deathrite Shamans. I kind of have 2 different answers to that problem.
Okay.
The first one is, if you look at most of the cards that have been banned out of Modern, and we kind of mentioned this earlier, if you look at most of the cards that have been banned out of Modern, the decks don't die, right? It's blue red Splinter Twin became Blue Moon,
right?
Birthing Pod became Collected Company literally within a month,
right?
So the decks that were powerful at those moments, those cards are still very good. Often it's not, decks are more than a single piece that they're based off of. Even Storm has famously had more cards banned out from under it than maybe any other mechanic
Right.
in history. And you were just talking in this episode how great Storm is doing.
Well, it's a great budget deck.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not saying Storm is doing great, but I'm saying that somebody with $80 in their pocket can build a budget Storm deck that actually will win, and then they can upgrade it for another couple $100 into a full-on Storm deck that will win. I don't know great win. I don't know that you're going to take down a GP, but I think in terms of there's a Modern event every Tuesday at my local game store. We get 16 plus players in there. I want to go in and play, and I don't have Jund money. Storm is a really good budget option.
And absolutely, I guess when I was saying it's good, I was meaning it's the deck isn't dead. It's a viable
not
option.
dead at all.
The other space, the other answer is kind of most of the time these bans are telegraphed. Especially now, there was an era of Modern where they would ban cards right before Magic Pro Tours that were featuring Modern as the main format out of a diversity kind of explanation, where that's where Splinter Twin was famously banned, right? And that's kind of the controversy around that card being on the ban list. There's an argument that that's why Birthing Pod was originally banned, where Birthing Pod was the best deck, then all the Delve spells were printed, then there was Delve Fall, but even in that moment, Birthing Pod was still a top 3 deck of the format, and they knew that if they banned Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time, but left Pod would just be the best deck at the tournament. So they banned all 3 to make sure that the Pro Tour is as diverse as possible. That banning philosophy, they've gone on the record and said they're no longer focusing on.
Good.
And so now it's more looking at what cards seem to be more problematic. And if anything, we're in the banning era of them looking at real engine cards and realizing, you know what? Faithless Looting is problematic. There's too many cards on this ban list that are banned because we don't want to ban Faithless Looting. Mox Opal is a similar and maybe a better prominent example where it's like we banned 4 cards on this ban list, if not more, if you include the artifact lands, because we know Mox Opal exists. Maybe we just get rid of Mox Opal and we no longer have to ban these other cards. But because generally you can kind of see, Oko's a problem. Oh, Hogak is a problem. Oh, the Eldrazi are a problem. You can avoid or start trading out of those decks in those moments when they're at their peak. So also your card should be worth, unless it's the week before the ban announcement, your card should be worth more than they normally would be. The other thing is you're generally not going to have a deck banned out from you if you're playing if you're not playing the best deck of the format, right? Like there's often the deck that gets banned is like problematic, and like the examples where it wasn't that I can think of are like Eggs, but Eggs was banned not due to it being the best deck in the format. It was banned because tournaments broke. Like famously Brian Kibler F6'd in his win and in for a GP because his opponent was going to take 2 20-minute turns during turns after every other person in the tournament was no longer playing, and he could leave for 5 minutes to go to the bathroom, and the judge just had to watch the game. So in an answer to like, if I'm afraid of a card being banned, even the decks I just named, though, a top 8 deck this last weekend was Eldrazi. Sean, like they banned Ayavugan, but Eldrazi has been a tier 1.5 to tier 1 to tier 2 deck since Oath of the Gatewatch. So like I do question, people are always like, oh, my deck was banned, it's bad. And almost every single time it comes back. Amulet Titan is another example, right? Like that famously had a card banned out from it, currently the best deck in the format. And it goes through phases. And then sometimes your other question was what happens when the metagame kind of moves past my deck. We're in a collectible card game. That's going to happen any format you're in to some extent. But even, Affinity is an example of that, right? Like when Affinity got Mox Opal banned recently, one of my statements was that deck wasn't good anyway. But it adopted Hardened Scales. It was playing Hardened Scale. It was moving its shell towards that deck where it was more about taking advantage of doubling counters. And that deck was more viable. And then it moved towards Urza, where Urza is more of the main attack engine and the artifact deck of the format. So I would even say, like, there are very few deck archetypes that if a card is banned out from them, if they were that good, are dead in the water. And the main examples are ones where they had to kill it for other reasons, like Eggs, where it's like, we can't let this deck work.
No. And it was just not fun to play against.
Yeah, it's unfun to play against, and it breaks the way GPs are ran because it can have 20-minute turns and you get 5 of them at the end of your round guaranteed, or you get at least 3 of them, or at least 2, if not 3 of them. And so they have to go for it every one of those 3 turns, which could be 60 minutes post the round.
What are some other resources besides your podcast that people could look to when deciding, which deck to pick and how best to understand the current climate of Modern? What are some of your go-tos?
I definitely live and breathe MTG Goldfish's Modern metagame page. The fact that they have like the top 10 spells that are being played, the top 10 creatures, top 10 lands. They also have a budget section separated from the other section.
Yeah, I think Seth does not get enough credit for those budget decks because people don't realize just how much testing he really does put into them.
Yeah.
There are some real diamonds in the rough down there that kind of get brushed off as like, yeah.
And then MTG Top 8 actually is a website that has kind of a consistent running of the top 8 lists from different tournaments. And they're also a really good resource just to get an idea of what top 8 right? Like, you don't need to play one of those decks. I often say that that's not what you need to do, but knowing what they are is helpful. You can see cards that are good. Like Call Against Command is not an expensive card, really, but can be played in strategies and is a very powerful card. And if you can take advantage of it, all the power to you. And then, so yeah, those are definitely like maybe the 2 main places our podcast uses when we deal with content. We also use Decked, the app, to like the brew. Any app that lets me brew when I'm on an airplane. I travel so much that non-internet based deck building software is extremely helpful in my life.
Right.
But then, yeah, I mean, I think those are probably the main resources.
Fantastic. If people want to find you and your podcast, where are you and what do you do?
I am on pretty much every platform at Kess Wiley. We do a Masters of Modern podcast where we talk about Modern every week. Often we do look at it from more of a lens of like a brewer's paradise and what cool things you can do. We have a philosophy of like, never say no to a card and see, can I use this card?
Yeah.
It makes our review episodes like way longer than we need them to be because of that. But I do Twitch streaming. So twitch.tv/Kesco. And Twitter is like the other main place to find us. I'm at Kess Wiley. All that's down here.
There, right.
And then the other thing is we do on our YouTube channel. So definitely check that out. We do not only do the podcast once a week, we do hot takes once a week. Ben is doing 10 minutes of magic every day, or not every day, but multiple times a week where we're like, whatever cool idea we have with. We're also going to start kind of coming out with more Commander content in the future. I also have a toy company. If you go to a Target or Walmart and you see really shiny hula hoops, I made those. I'm the largest manufacturer of hula hoops in the world. We call it the ice hoop. And then, or drop dot balls, these really cool feeling spiky balls that are out there. So definitely check those out too.
Very cool. While I have you here, I do want to shift gears really quickly to Pioneer. Do you believe, honestly, do you believe there is any reason to play Pioneer over Modern?
Sure. I mean, if your local game store is running Pioneer tournaments, not Modern tournaments, like the reason I don't play Legacy is because my stores don't run it, not because I don't want to play Legacy. And there's different deck strategies. If you like a deck in Pioneer that isn't viable in Modern or vice versa, then play the format you want to play.
Now imagine tomorrow they unban all fetch lands from Pioneer. Is there any reason, if fetch lands are legal in Pioneer, to play Pioneer over Modern?
No.
Didn't I send you back in time to the middle of a dangerous and very lethal explosion?
Yep, burnt my hair clean off, but no matter, I looked pretty good bald. Also, I bought up every copy of Fetchlands that I could get my hands on while I was back in the past. I'm gonna be rich as long as Wizards of the Coast never reprints them in a meaningful way.
You'll be fine.